I never thought a lazy Saturday morning would end with me being $2,000 poorer, or smarter, depending on how you look at it. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting my little slice of heaven in soft gold, when I noticed my neighbor, Karen, striding down my private dock with the sort of righteous fury usually reserved for courtroom dramas. And yes, she was wielding a clipboard. "I hope you realize," she said, her voice a pitch-perfect mixture of outrage and smugness, "that swimming in a lake without permission violates HOA Rules 47B and 102D. I blinked, trying to comprehend the sheer audacity. This lake was my lake. I had lived on this property for 10 years, paid every tax, maintained the damn thing like a mini-park, and yet here was Karen, a self-appointed enforcer of community standards, telling me I couldn't enjoy my own backyard. "Karen," I started cautiously, "this is my property, my lake. I think you might be confusing." "Excuse me," she cut in sharply, jabbing the clipboard like a weapon. "The HOA has rules, and rules are rules. I'll be submitting a formal fine. $2,000. Effective immediately. $2,000. My stomach dropped faster than a cannonball into the lake. And that's when something in me clicked. It wasn't just indignation, it was absurdity. $2,000 for taking a dip in the water I'd personally shoveled and cleaned? That was a challenge. That was a war cry. By the time Karen stumped back to a pristine little golf cart, I was already plotting my retaliation. Not the petty, screaming at the fence type of retaliation. Oh no, this required precision, flair, and a little bit of genius. If she thought she could slap me with fines and enforce rules without consequence, she had another thing coming. It started with reading the HOA bylaws cover to cover, a task I'd avoided for years, thinking it was just a boring stack of legalese. But hidden in that dense paper jungle was a loophole so sweet, so satisfying, that it almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of my dock. And once I realized how to use it, well, let's just say the HOA was about to get a taste of their own medicine. I spent the next hour scheming, pacing, and taking notes like a criminal mastermind planning the heist of the century. Karen had no idea that her precious finds were about to boomerang. The lake was my arena, the clipboard was my trigger, and my next move would turn this small suburban feud into something legendary. By the time the sun climbed higher over my private lake, I had turned what could have been a simple Saturday into a full-blown strategic operation. I grabbed my laptop, a mug of strong coffee, and a legal pad, and set up camp on the dock like a general preparing for battle. The fine itself, it was a bait, but the real prize was proving that Karen and the HOA couldn't mess with me without consequences. I started with the bylaws. And wow, HOA legalese is a kind of thing that can induce insomnia just by reading it. Paragraphs upon paragraphs of rules about lawn heights, mailbox colors, and, of course, water usage rights. But buried in the monotony was my golden ticket, a clause specifying that any fines imposed on a property owner had to follow a strict process, including documented warnings, opportunity for a hearing, and, most deliciously, provisions for fines to be contested if the property owner could demonstrate reasonable usage of their property. Swimming in your own lake counts as reasonable usage, I thought smugly, jotting down notes. Karen had jumped the gun, and I was about to turn her impulsive aggression into my advantage. But first, I needed intelligence. I spent the next few hours observing Karen from a safe distance. Well, semi-safe, if you count pretending to water my ornamental reeds while secretly monitoring her patrol routes. She had a ritual, morning coffee at 8, clipboard inspections between 9 and 10, and a suspiciously long phone call at 11. The more I watched, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just annoying. She was predictable. And predictable is exploitable. Next came the financial angle. I dug into the HOA fee structure, something I'd ignored for years. Turns out, the HOA had a series of escalating fees. First a warning, then a fine, then, here it was, the kicker, additional administrative fees for enforcing fines. My little brain whirred. If I could contest a $2,000 fine using the reasonable usage clause, I could not only erase it but potentially trigger those administrative fees against the HOA instead. I sketched a plan, scribbling diagrams and flowcharts on my legal pad like I was plotting a bank heist instead of suburban warfare. The goal was simple. Swim in the lake as much as I wanted. Trigger the formal fine process. Contest a fine using HOA bylaws. Watch as the HOA incurred fees and bureaucracy that far exceeded their initial $2,000 claim. It was diabolical, elegant, and, in a twisted way, fair. By afternoon, I needed reinforcements. My neighbors were, let's call them, casually invested in local drama, which was perfect. I recruited Sam, the guy from 3 houses down who thought spreadsheets were fun, and his wife, Lisa, who had a law degree but preferred raising alpacas. They were intrigued, to say the least, and when I pitched a plan over iced tea in Sam's yard, their eyes lit up like kids hearing a story about treasure. Wait, you're saying you can make the HOA pay for their own fine? Sam asked, nearly choking on his tea. Exactly, I said, grinning. They fine me for swimming in my lake. I fight it, follow the bylaws to the letter, and they rack up administrative costs enforcing a fine that shouldn't even exist. And if we're careful, they can't touch us legally because we're fully within our rights. Lisa clapped her hands together. This is perfect. And ethical. Well, technically. By late afternoon, we were ready for Phase 1, the reconnaissance swim. I donned my old, slightly faded swim trunks and walked down to the dock, carrying nothing but a waterproof speaker for moral support. The water was perfect, cool, refreshing, and mine. I dove in with a flourish, imagining Karen's expression if she could see me. Halfway through, I heard a familiar rustling. I peeked over the reeds and saw Karen lurking on the shore, clutching her clipboard like it was a life preserver. I waved cheerfully. Hello again. I called. Beautiful day for a swim, isn't it? She squinted, clearly trying to decide if I was mocking her or just insane. You know the rules, she called, her voice brittle with irritation. Yes, I said, floating on my back, and I'm within them, according to 47B and 102D, which, by the way, I've read thoroughly. Her glare could have melted steel. She muttered something about the audacity of homeowners and stalked back toward her golf cart, clipboard clutched like a shield. I surfaced, grinning, feeling like a kid who had just stolen candy in broad daylight and gotten away with it. That first swim wasn't just about exercising. It was about sending a signal. I was ready. I was clever, and Karen had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. By evening, the planning shifted to logistics. I would need to document every swim, every interaction with Karen, every step she took in enforcing the fine. Sam volunteered his drone, which, frankly, looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie, to record interaction from above. Lisa offered to draft a preemptive contest letter for the HOA, complete with citations from the bylaws and politely scathing commentary. I lay awake that night imagining the fallout. The HOA board meetings, the forced hearings, the emails flying back and forth. The drama would be glorious. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized something important. This wasn't just about the money. It was about setting a precedent. If I could outsmart the HOA, I could reclaim a tiny piece of sanity in a world obsessed with arbitrary rules enforced by people named Karen. By the next morning, I was ready to execute Phase 2, the official challenge. I brewed an extra strong pot of coffee, printed the carefully drafted documents, and rehearsed my calm, confident tone. Karen might have thought she had the upper hand yesterday, but today, the game changed. And so, with a smake, I stepped into my lake once more, ready to turn a simple swim into an unforgettable showdown. The morning sun glinted off the lake like a spotlight, as if it knew today would be historic. I sipped my coffee on the dock, trying to keep my hand steady while my mind raced through the strategy for the first official confrontation with Karen. Phase 2, filing the contest letter and documenting the swimming incident. Phase 3, letting the bureaucratic machine grind against itself. Phase 4, ultimate vindication. Sam and Lisa had arrived early, armed with a laptop, drone, and an impressive arsenal of stationery. Sam, who had a habit of over-preparing for everything, brought a binder labeled HOA Retaliation Tracker, while Lisa carried an airtight legal argument, complete with citations and footnotes. It was like the Avengers of suburban warfare. I stepped out onto the dock and stretched, then waved as Karen appeared again, apparently on a mission to patrol every inch of the property she didn't own. Today, she had brought reinforcements. Mr. Thompson, her loyal HOA sidekick, who wore khaki pants and a tie as though he just stepped out of an office instead of a golf cart. Good morning. I called with my most innocent smile. What brings you to my lake today? Karen's expression was pure fury wrapped in polyester. I've come to ensure compliance with the HOA fine, she snapped. You were supposed to stop swimming until the matter was resolved. I tilted my head. Interesting. You see, the bylaws don't explicitly forbid swimming while the fine is under contest. In fact, Section 47B, Paragraph 4, allows reasonable use pending dispute resolution. Karen blinked. I could practically see her brain short-circuiting behind those oversized sunglasses. She opened her clipboard, flipping pages furiously. That can't be right, she muttered. Oh, it's right, I said calmly. And I've documented every swim since your initial notice. Time, duration, temperature readings of the water, and even drone footage, courtesy of Sam here. Sam maneuvered the drone above the lake, capturing every angle with military precision. Lisa handed me the preemptive contest letter, which I held aloft like a sword. This, I said, is an official contest of your fine, citing violations of proper procedure and my rights as a property owner. Karen's jaw tightened. Mr. Thompson coughed awkwardly, clearly aware that he was in over his head. I'll take this to the board, Karen stammered, retreating toward her golf cart. But I knew she was rattled, and that was the first victory. Over the next few days, the HOA bureaucracy sprang into motion, exactly as I had anticipated. Emails were sent, forms were filed, and notices were posted, each one requiring signatures, approvals, and confirmations. And every single document I received came with a new administrative fee, fees that Karen had triggered by acting impulsively in the first place. I began to chronicle everything in meticulous detail, tracking her attempts to enforce the fine and cataloging the administrative costs she had unintentionally incurred. I even gave a name, the Karen Cost Ledger. By the end of the week, it was already starting to look impressive, a living, breathing testament to the absurdity of HOA overreach. Karen, meanwhile, escalated her tactics. She tried to catch me in the act, posting herself near the dock with binoculars and a sun hat so wide it could double as a parasol. I decided to turn it into entertainment. One afternoon, I floated on an inflatable swan while waving cheerfully at her, armed with a waterproof speaker blasting smooth jazz. Her scowl could have curdled milk from half a mile away. But it wasn't all fun and games. Lisa and I spent hours drafting airtight arguments for the official HOA hearing. We cited bylaws, previous cases, and even referenced obscure clauses about reasonable enjoyment of property. I had to admit, it was thrilling to wield this kind of knowledge against someone so certain of their authority. Then came the phone call that would set the stage for the ultimate showdown. Karen had formally escalated the dispute to the HOA board, and they had scheduled a hearing. The timing was perfect. She thought she was winning, but in reality, she was stepping right into my trap. The day of the hearing arrived, and I prepared like a seasoned lawyer. Sam had printed multiple copies of every document. Lisa had rehearsed her arguments in front of the mirror, and I had donned a collared shirt to look serious but approachable. Karen, of course, appeared in full armor, power blazer, clipboard, and an expression of smug triumph. The meeting room was tense. HOA members shuffled papers and adjusted reading glasses, clearly trying to maintain neutrality. Karen launched into a prepared statement, highlighting the egregious violation and the need for enforcement. I listened politely, taking notes and nodding sagely. Then it was my turn. I stood, cleared my throat, and began, "Members of the board, I'd like to formally contest a $2,000 fine issued for swimming in my own lake. According to the bylaws, as well as documented precedent within this community, the fine was not properly issued. Furthermore, my activities fall under the clause of reasonable enjoyment of property, which explicitly allows this usage." I presented the Karen Cost Ledger, documenting every administrative action she had taken to enforce the fine. "As you can see," I continued, "every step taken to penalize me has incurred additional costs, which, according to HOA rules, cannot be unfairly imposed on the homeowner. I respectfully request that the fine be rescinded and all administrative fees reviewed for fairness." The room went quiet. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, and Mr. Thompson muttered something that sounded like, "This is impossible." A few board members whispered to each other, clearly intrigued by the sheer audacity of my argument. After what felt like hours, the board announced that they would review the evidence and issue a formal decision within 7 days. 7 days of Karen fuming, of Sam watching her scowl from a distance, and of me floating peacefully in my lake, secure in the knowledge that the wheels of bureaucracy were grinding against themselves. I left the meeting triumphant. Karen, of course, shot me a glare that could appear steel. But in my heart, I knew I had won the first battle. The fine was under dispute, the administrative fees were mounting, and Karen's authority was already being undermined by her own overzealous enforcement. That night, I celebrated with a swim under the moonlight, floating on my back and imagining the chaos that was slowly unfolding within the HOA. Sam and Lisa joined me, and we toasted with sparkling water, laughing at how a simple swim had escalated into full-blown suburban warfare. Little did Karen know, this was only the beginning. I had planned every move carefully, anticipating every possible countermeasure. The lake was mine, the bylaws were my shield, and Karen had inadvertently armed me with all the tools I needed to turn the tables completely. As I drifted under the stars, I realized something profound. Victory in this war wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming freedom, sanity, and a little bit of fun in a world obsessed with control. And with Phase 3 looming, the moment when the HOA would officially feel the consequences of their own rules, I couldn't help but grin. The Karen Chronicles, as I had begun to call them, were only getting started. The week after the HOA hearing felt like a mix between a suspense thriller and a comedy of errors. Karen was now officially on high alert, patrolling my lake like a hawk and muttering HOA clauses under her breath as if reciting them aloud would magically make me guilty. Every time I stepped outside, I half expected her to jump out from behind a bush with a megaphone and a notebook, ready to document my crimes. But I had a secret weapon, patience and preparation. I knew that bureaucracies, especially small HOA boards staffed by volunteers with a taste for power but little understanding of the rules, moved slowly, and I intended to exploit every single delay, loophole, and procedural hiccup. Step 1 of my escalation plan was simple: maximize visibility. I scheduled daily swims at precise intervals, carefully noting the time, water temperature, and even the number of ducks present on the lake. I wanted to make sure that every swim, every leisurely cannonball, was documented for the record. I wasn't just swimming, I was gathering evidence. Drone footage, timestamp photographs, and even witness statements from neighbors who had begun to gather at a safe distance to cheer me on like some suburban gladiator. One particularly enthusiastic neighbor, Mrs. Patel, even brought a homemade banner that read, "Let him swim." Karen, predictably, was livid. She began emailing the HOA board almost hourly, documenting my presence in the lake, each email growing increasingly dramatic. I saved every single one. Each complaint she sent triggered a new round of administrative forms, approvals, and signatures, all at HOA expense. Then came the genius stroke, the counterfine clause. In reading the HOA bylaws, I had discovered that any frivolous or improperly issued fines could be appealed, and if successful, the offending party could be assessed the very administrative fees they had incurred. In other words, Karen's obsession with fining me could now cost her, and the HOA, far more than the original $2,000. I carefully drafted an official appeal, citing every procedural misstep, the lack of proper notice, and my reasonable use of my property. I attached detailed logs of my swims, along with timestamps, photos, and even a graph of weekly water usage to prove that my lake activities were well within acceptable limits. The final touch was a Karen cost ledger, which now had its own cover page, table of contents, and color-coded chart showing administrative fees incurred as a direct result of her enforcement actions. Delivering the appeal felt like sending a bomb into enemy territory. I printed multiple copies, bound them neatly, and personally submitted them to the HOA office while wearing my serious but approachable face. Karen was there, of course, and she froze when she saw me stride confidently toward the front desk, carrying what looked like a briefcase of doom. "This is an appeal," I said calmly, placing the documents on the receptionist's desk. "Please process it according to standard HOA procedures." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and she glared daggers at me. I almost waved, but decided against it. Some victories are sweeter when silently savored. Within hours, the board began reviewing the appeal. I watched the email fly back and forth like a high-stakes chess match. Every step Karen had taken to enforce her initial fine was now being scrutinized, questioned, and, most importantly, documented. Each email or form she submitted added to the tally of administrative fees that could potentially be reassessed to her. Meanwhile, I continued my routine swims, each one timed perfectly to coincide with the most obsessive patrol times. One afternoon, I floated lazily on my inflatable swan, sipping lemonade while the drone hovered above, capturing the spectacle. Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, but this time I was prepared. "Enjoying your swim," she barked. "Absolutely," I said with a serene smile. "It's very therapeutic." Her glare could have burned a hole through the inflatable, but I ignored it. By now, the neighbors had started quietly cheering from their porches, and I could hear faint applause whenever I did a cannonball. The lake had become a stage, and Karen was the unwitting antagonist in my suburban epic. By midweek, the board had convened a special session to review my appeal. I wasn't present. Why would I attend when the evidence spoke for itself? But I received a call from Lisa later that evening. Her tone was barely containing her laughter. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "The board is seriously considering assessing the administrative fees against Karen for the procedural error she made in forcing your fine." I laughed so hard I almost dropped my phone into the lake. "Wait, so she's going to pay for her own obsession?" "Yes," Lisa said. "It's like HOA Karma. They are taking this very seriously. They are calling it a cautionary example." I couldn't help but admire the poetic justice. Karen, who had been so intent on policing my lake activities, was about to learn the hard way that bureaucracy has teeth, and those teeth sometimes bite the wrong person. But I wasn't done. There was one final move I had been saving, the community showcase. With permission from the board, I decided to host a lake day to demonstrate proper usage and enjoyment of private property in a light-hearted, educational manner. Flyers went up, neighbors RSVP'd, and on the day of the event, my lake was filled with people swimming, paddleboarding, and floating on inflatables, all fully compliant with HOA bylaws, of course. Karen showed up, predictably, clipboard at the ready. But instead of confronting me, she was now caught between documenting the event and facing the reality that everyone was enjoying themselves legally. She looked like a cat trapped in a room full of rocking chairs. "See," I said, floating by in a small inflatable kayak, waving. "Completely reasonable. No rules broken. Everyone's happy, just like the bylaws say." Karen sputtered, flustered, and muttered something about precedent under her breath. Mr. Thompson attempted to intervene, but was quickly drowned out by neighbors cheering and laughing. The lake, once a battleground, had become a stage for subtle but undeniable triumph. By the end of the day, I had fully cemented my victory. The HOA could no longer fine me. Karen's obsessive enforcement had been publicly exposed, and the administrative fees were piling up against her. The Karen cost ledger had become legendary, passed around discreetly among the board members with knowing smiles. That night, I floated alone under the stars, savoring the quiet victory. The lake was calm, the air crisp, and I realized something profound. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about autonomy, about standing up to petty tyranny, and about turning absurdity into triumph. Karen may have started this war, but I had turned it into a masterclass of patience, strategy, and subtle humor. And I knew, deep down, that the story was far from over. The final chapter, where the consequences for her actions were formally recorded and celebrated, was yet to come. But for now, as I drifted beneath the moonlight, I allowed myself to savor the sweet, sparkling taste of victory. The lake was mine, the bylaws were my shield, and Karen had learned, albeit reluctantly, that some homeowners are not to be trifled with. The stage was set. The audience, my neighbors, the board, and even Karen herself, was captivated. And the final act, when the fines would be reversed and the administrative costs fully realized, promised to be nothing short of spectacular. The morning of the HOA ruling dawned bright and clear, a perfect reflection of the anticipation buzzing through my little suburban kingdom. I had slept fitfully the night before, visions of Karen scowling and board members calculating fees dancing through my head. After all, this was the moment everything I had carefully orchestrated would come to fruition. I arrived at the HOA office with Sam and Lisa in tow, carrying nothing but my notebook, coffee, and an aura of quiet confidence. Karen was already there, flanked by Mr. Thompson, looking as if she had personally been assigned to enforce global order and failed. Her blazer was ironed to perfection, her clipboard at the ready, but even she seemed vaguely aware that she was walking into a trap of her own making. The meeting room was small, with harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone's expression feel exaggerated. Board members shuffled papers, whispered among themselves, and occasionally peeked at the Karen cost ledger I had left in their hands a week prior. I could see the smiles, suppressed, professional smiles, but smiles nonetheless, on their faces. They knew the absurdity that had unfolded. The board president, Mr. Whitaker, cleared his throat and began. After reviewing the appeal submitted by Mr. My Name, along with the supporting documentation and records, the board has reached a decision regarding the $2,000 fine issued for swimming in the private lake. He paused dramatically, flipping through a thick binder. Karen leaned forward, her face taut with anticipation, or perhaps fear. The board finds that the initial fine was improperly issued and lacks sufficient procedural backing as required under Section 47B in Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws. I felt a grin spreading across my face. My chest tightened with the thrill of vindication. Karen's jaw dropped. Mr. Thompson blinked like a deer in headlights. Sam let out a quiet whoop, while Lisa discreetly fist-bumped me under the table. Furthermore, Mr. Whitaker continued, due to repeated administrative actions taken by the HOA at the instigation of Ms. Karen, last name withheld, which were deemed unnecessary and outside the proper enforcement process, the board has decided to assess administrative fees against Ms. Karen personally. The words hit like cannon fire. Karen's mouth opened and closed as if trying to speak, but no sound emerged. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. This includes all costs incurred during the investigation, documentation, and attempted enforcement of the improper fine, Mr. Whitaker said, his tone matter-of-fact. Total assessed fees, $1,450. Ms. Karen is personally responsible for these amounts. I nearly fell out of my chair laughing. The HOA had essentially reversed the fine, and the instigator, Karen, was now the one financially penalized for her obsession. It was poetic justice in its purest, most satisfying form. Karen finally found her voice, though it trembled with rage. This is unfair. I was only doing my duty. Your duty, Mr. Whitaker said calmly, does not include issuing fines without following proper procedure. The board has spoken, and the decision is final. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The lake, my peaceful retreat for so many years, was officially recognized as my domain. The bylaws had been interpreted fairly, and the board had sided with reason over petty vendetta. The culmination of planning, patience, and precise documentation had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. Once the official ruling was read aloud, the room felt almost celebratory. Sam whistled softly under his breath, while Lisa gave me a sly grin, clearly reveling in the victory. Even a few board members allowed themselves small smiles, clearly amused by the drama they'd witnessed. Karen, meanwhile, slumped in her chair, staring at her clipboard like it had personally betrayed her. She muttered something about loopholes and next time, but her words carried no weight. The entire room had seen the absurdity, and any future attempt at overreach would likely be met with skepticism or outright mockery. After the meeting adjourned, I walked out to the lake, the late afternoon sun reflecting off the water in warm, shimmering patterns. I stripped down to my swim trunks and waded in, savoring the cool water against my skin. This wasn't just a swim, it was a victory lap. The lake, my lake, had survived bureaucracy, harassment, and one particularly determined Karen. Neighbors had gathered quietly, some clapping, some simply observing with knowing smiles. Mrs. Patel waved a homemade "Let Him Swim" banner, which I now hoisted proudly as I paddled across the water. Children splashed around, ducks floated lazily nearby, and I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The lake was alive, vibrant, and free. I floated on my back, looking up at the sky. It struck me how absurd the entire ordeal had been. $2,000 in fines, endless emails, drone footage, and neighbor spectators, all for the simple act of swimming in my own lake. Yet, somehow, it had become more than that. It was a story, A legend in miniature, a tale of strategy, persistence, and subtle revenge executed with style. Later, at a small celebratory gathering organized by the neighbors, I recounted the events with careful dramatization. Sam narrated the drone footage, Lisa highlighted the legal strategy, and the Karen cost ledger was passed around, now legendary among the community. We laughed, we cheered, and I realized something important. This story wasn't just about me or Karen. It was about reclaiming control, enjoying life, and proving that knowledge and preparation could triumph over petty authority. Karen didn't attend the gathering, of course. I heard later that she had submitted a formal complaint about the event. Ironically, another administrative action that generated yet more fees she would now be responsible for. I couldn't help but chuckle. Karma, it seemed, had a very specific sense of timing and justice. That night, as I lay on my dock watching the moonlight dance across the water, I reflected on the entire saga. It had begun with anger, frustration, and a ridiculous $2,000 fine, but it had ended with clarity, victory, and a subtle reminder to anyone who might overreach. Don't underestimate a homeowner who knows their rights. The lake was calm, the stars were bright, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. Karen had been defeated, not with rage, but with patience, strategy, and evidence. The HOA had learned a valuable lesson. The neighbors had a story to tell, and I had a lake that was finally and unquestionably mine. And as I floated there, I made a silent vow. Never again would a petty bureaucrat take away the simple joy of enjoying my property. The water was mine, the bylaws were my shield, and every cannonball, every lazy swim, every moment of peace was a testament to victory. The saga wasn't just a story of fines, bureaucracy, and petty power. It was a story about standing up, thinking strategically, and claiming what's rightfully yours. And as I dug beneath the surface and resurfaced with a triumphant grin, I knew the lake would forever be my arena, my sanctuary, and my personal triumph over absurdity. The Karen Chronicles had reached their peak, and for once, justice had been served, not with yelling or confrontation, but with cleverness, planning, and a little bit of flair. Life after the HOA ruling felt almost surreal. The lake, my battleground turned sanctuary, sparkled like it had never done before. Every ripple, every gentle splash of water against the dock was a quiet reminder of the hard-fought victory. The $2,000 fine that had once felt like an impossible burden was now a punchline in the story I would tell for years to come. I had returned to my normal routine, or at least what passed for normal in the aftermath of the Great HOA War. My mornings began with coffee on the dock, followed by careful observation of the lake. I swam, paddled, and floated freely, a little prouder each time I cannonballed into the water. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of peace that only comes when a battle is finally won. Neighbors still whispered about the Karen Chronicles, some with amusement, some with admiration. Sam had unofficially declared himself the documentarian of the saga, maintaining a folder on his computer filled with screenshots, emails, and drone footage. Lisa, of course, insisted it would make a perfect case study on HOA law, though I suspect she mostly enjoyed reliving the drama. Karen, on the other hand, had largely retreated from the scene. Rumor had it she had requested a transfer to another HOA, or perhaps just a quieter life where she wouldn't have to deal with the consequences of her own overzealous enforcement. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of her in the distance, clipboard in hand, but she never approached. I imagined she spent hours recalculating every move she'd made and realizing, too late, that she had lost spectacularly. The lake itself seemed different now, infused with a sense of freedom and triumph. I had begun hosting small gatherings, picnics, swim days, even a casual kayak race, inviting neighbors to enjoy the water without fear of fines or scrutiny. Everyone was thrilled, laughing, and splashing, and I noticed that the sense of community grew stronger with each event. Ironically, Karen's obsession with control had ultimately created an opportunity for genuine connection. One afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the absurdity of the entire situation. $2,000, countless hours of research, drone footage, and meticulous documentation, all for a few swims in my own lake. Yet, when I considered the outcome, I realized it wasn't the money or even the fees that mattered most. It was a principle, standing up for your rights, thinking strategically, and refusing to be bullied by petty authority. That lesson alone was priceless. I even began sharing the story online in local forums, carefully avoiding any mention of name for legal reasons, of course. People were fascinated, commenting on how someone had turned bureaucracy on its head. I received messages from homeowners in other neighborhoods facing similar petty fines, thanking me for showing that it was possible to fight back without descending into petty chaos. It was a reminder that humor, intelligence, and persistence could win the day. There were humorous consequences as well. I discovered that Karen's personal administrative fees had become somewhat of a legend among board members. Whenever she raised her voice about a minor infraction or tried to enforce a new rule, members would exchange knowing glances, quietly calculating potential costs as she acted rashly. She had become both infamous and ironically powerless, a cautionary tale in miniature. The lake days became more elaborate over time. I even introduced themed swims, cannonball Fridays, paddleboard Sundays, and floating movie nights, when neighbors would watch films projected onto a screen at the water's edge while lounging on inflatable rafts. Every event reinforced a sense of ownership, community, and triumph. The lake was no longer just mine. It belonged to the collective joy of everyone who had witnessed the absurdity of Karen's overreach and celebrated the victory of reason. Occasionally, I would glance at the Karen cost ledger, now framed and displayed in my study. It had grown over time, with annotations and colorful charts, a reminder of both the meticulous planning that had led to victory and the absurdity that had sparked it. It became a conversation piece, a symbol of humor and cleverness prevailing over unnecessary bureaucracy. Even legal experts I consulted occasionally for advice on HOA bylaws found the story amusing. They praised my strategic thinking and thorough documentation. You turned a $2,000 fine into a case study on how not to enforce HOA rules, one attorney remarked. I chuckled and nodded. Yes, I had won not just a battle, but also a kind of subtle notoriety. Looking back, I realized how much the experience had changed me. I had learned patience, the value of research, and the power of careful planning. More importantly, I had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't mean yelling louder than the other person. It means understanding the rules, knowing your rights, and quietly ensuring that the consequences of someone else's overreach land where they belong. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the lake in shades of orange and pink, I took one last swim before dinner. I floated on my back, letting the water carry me gently, listening to the soft chorus of frogs and birds settling in for the night. It was peaceful. It was mine. And it was a victory not just over Karen, not just over the HOA, but over absurdity itself. As I climbed out of the water and wrapped myself in a towel, I thought about the future. The lake would continue to be a sanctuary, a playground, and a symbol of clever triumph. Karen, hopefully, would find new pursuits less directly tied to my happiness. And I would continue enjoying the simple pleasures of life, sunshine, water, laughter, and the rare, sweet satisfaction of having outsmarted a petty adversary. In the end, the saga had taught me something crucial. Life is too short to let minor bureaucrats dictate your happiness. Sometimes, the best response to absurdity is creativity, persistence, and a little bit of humor. That $2,000 fine had been a spark, igniting a series of events that ultimately led to personal empowerment, community enjoyment, and a story worth telling over and over again. And so, as I watched the moonlight shimmer across the lake and the stars reflect in the water like tiny pinpricks of approval, I smiled. The Karen Chronicles had concluded, at least in my backyard. The lake was peaceful, the neighborhood was laughing, and I had learned a lesson that no fine could ever take away. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply winning, and enjoying every single splash along the way. The lake was mine. The bylaws were my ally. And Karen, Karen had finally learned that in the delicate balance between control and freedom, cleverness and patience will always tip the scales. I took a deep breath of crisp night air, leaned back on the dock, and allowed the quiet victory to wash over me. This wasn't just a story about fines and lakes. It was a story about strategy, justice, and the undeniable joy of reclaiming your space in a world that often tries to control it. And for once, everything had gone exactly right.